Hello everyone, today I'm very excited to show you a game played by Magnus Carlsen against a 2100 rated player named Manuel Ramirez Garrastacho. And excuse my Spanish there. So, as you can see, a bit of a change of scenery here. We have some or a lot of light. And yeah, so let's dive into the game. So, this was played in the Norwegian League, 11th round. Let's see what happened in this game. So Magnus opens up with e4, c5 is played, the Sicilian defense, knight f3, knight c6. Perhaps offering white to play d4 and venture into some kind of Svechnikov or Kalashnikov. That would be quite gutsy by Mr. Manuel because, as we all know, Magnus is one of the, I wouldn't say pioneers, but he's one of the revitalizers of the Svechnikov at the top level. So knight c3 is played, a tricky move by Magnus. The Svechnikov would go as follows: d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4. Now knight f6, and here knight c3, e5, and after knight db5, d6 we have the Svechnikov. And I'm going to take a little bit of a look at the main line here so we can compare what happened in the game. So this is the main line Svechnikov. White gets control of the d5 square, but black in turn has some queenside counterplay, and he's able usually to dislodge this knight, and this knight isn't so well placed. It needs some moves to get rerouted. So black usually can be said to have not equalized, but black is trying to go for equality pretty soon. Dynamic equality, of course. So this is what Carlsen has been playing. But Carlsen here plays knight c3, intending a different kind of idea, intending perhaps to keep it closed and play some bishop b5 or bishop c4. But actually, after d6, he reverts back to the open Sicilian. And in this case, now perhaps knight f6 is possible, aiming to transpose into the classical Sicilian. This is the classical Sicilian. The usual move order of the classical Sicilian would be knight f3 and now d6. d4 takes, knight, knight c3, and knight c6. This is the classical Sicilian. The same position here, but from a different move order. This was still possible. Perhaps some weird type of position with a6 here is also possible. Maybe later on aiming for some Khanish setup or Taimanov setup. And what we can see from the live book here, from the Grandmaster book, usually they transpose back to knight f6, but e5 is the second most popular move. So against e5, many moves have been tried. Knight f3 is the move Carlsen goes for. Knight de2 is also possible, aiming to cleverly reroute this knight to c3. So we can see here, this knight goes to c3, and we get a firm grip on d5. And even more support for the d5 square. Now, a very important strategic principle that will guide us through the entire game here. This is the basic principle that guides us through the entire game, is that after e5, d5 is critically weakened. So this is extremely important to note. And this pawn is a backward pawn, so it can be attacked. And this is what will guide us through this entire game. So it's all about the battle for this d5 square. We want to put pieces on d5. The knight here, the bishop, the queen supporting d5, maybe a rook coming to d5, the second rook. All of these pieces attacked firmly on d5. So this is very important to note. Okay, so knight f3 was played. Knight f5 again is also possible. This is another line. Black loses the bishop pair, but there's perhaps some counterplay to be had with e4. Okay, so knight f3 was played by Carlsen. Now I want to compare this also to a line in the Kalashnikov. Now this position has occurred here. Now let's compare this line to a line in the Kalashnikov, which arises after knight c6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4. And now instead of knight f6, e5. Now e5, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3. Here the best move is of course bishop b4, pinning and creating some problems here. If bishop d3, there's this d5 idea, or taking and d5. So this is generally equal, but here if black doesn't want to do that and plays d6, again we have a transposition to the game. See, it's a direct transposition. So this line is a direct transposition. See, I'm just clicking through them and they're transposing. Okay, so this is also a possibility, but in general this line is so rare because you can't reach it from the Kalashnikov or the Svechnikov in normal moves. So here this line is generally quite rare. Okay, it happened, and knight f6 now, which might be a slight inaccuracy. The best move probably is h6. We'll find out why now. Bishop e7 is also an alternative. After bishop c4, now you play knight f6. This is perhaps an alternative, but it probably runs into the same thing that happened in the game, which is bishop g5. So after knight f6, Magnus played bishop g5. And now, remember what I said about the d5 square. The strategy is very clear. Magnus wants to take this knight, because it's one of the defenders of d5, and wants to keep this bishop passive. So the optimal scenario for white would be to trade all of these pieces for all of these pieces. To trade all of these pieces for all of these pieces, and remain with this knight against this bishop, which would be a bad bishop against a good knight versus a bad bishop. So this is the optimal strategy, and taking here is one step in the right direction. That's why h6 is very crucial, and actually the engine recommendation at very high depths to stop bishop g5. So knight f6 may be a slight inaccuracy. So bishop g5 and now bishop e6. Bishop e7 has been tried, but this leads to the same thing. And now bishop c4, very important, adding more control over d5. And this slightly favors white. So bishop e6, all the same. Bishop takes f6. This position has occurred 3 times, as you can see from the Elite Chess Master database. And here queen d2, g3 has been played. But now bishop takes f6 is what Magnus played. So here, actually, I wrote novelty for this move. It should actually be for the next move. Bishop takes f6 has been tried 1 time, but g takes f6 is the novelty. And this, oh no, it's not. Okay then, never mind. It's not strictly a novelty. It's a very rare line that's only occurred once, but strictly not a novelty. Okay, the novelty occurs later. So g takes f6, and now bishop d3. So we can talk a bit about queen takes f6, but again knight d5. Should he take? Of course we don't take like this, because that would remove the the weakness on this this pawn. So we take with the queen, because we want to keep this pawn backward and weak, and we want access to the d5 square with our pieces. So we never take with the pawn. Okay, but g takes f6 instead. G takes f6 aims to play f5. So Magnus stops that, puts the kibosh on that move, and like if bishop e2, f5. So that would equalize actually for black. So bishop d3 is very important. Now rook g8. Instead of rook g8, d5 could be tried, but after takes, we win the bishop pair back. So now we're getting closer to this endgame. The endgame I noted was knight against bishop, but also if we get an endgame of bishop against bishop, usually the endgame is drawn, of course, because it's opposite colored bishops, but in the middle game, in the middle game, opposite colored bishops favor the attacking side, which is of course white, because this bishop is so passive. It has some squares here, but it's really not doing anything. These pawns really kill off this bishop, while this bishop has a lot of great squares. And instead of rook g8 actually is the novelty. If I want to type that, that would be the novelty. This now, no more games here. So also h5 is possible, aiming to try to get some space here. But knight h4 mechanically stops the h5 pawn and adds further support to the d5 pawn, to the stopping the f5 break. But now d5 is possible, but again the same thing happens, and now we get a bishop on f5. Yes, this move might seem strange at first because we would think we would want to use the knight, but actually we use the bishop because if we use the knight there's maybe some e4, which might not be so optimal. In this case, yes, it would be losing a piece, right? Because of this we take here. So bishop takes d5, and here we put the bishop here. The knight's function is to mechanically block this pawn, and eventually we can reroute it to e4, which would be an incredibly strong square for the knight. Imagine the knight and the bishop here. And we can play, note that we can play at c3 at any time to stop knight d4. So black's knight coming to the center is easily stopped, while ours is not. Our knight on e4 cannot be dislodged, and if it comes to f5, it cannot be dislodged. So black has a lot of weaknesses in this position. So anyway, rook g8 was played, and now there are three ways to react. Castling, which would take the game into a different route. Knight h4 and g3. I much prefer knight h4 to get this queen active and put a clamp on f5. But Magnus chose g3. Of course, it's a fine move. It gains control over these two squares. And Magnus clearly wants to castle long now. Not with the queen. He wants to castle long. So he chose g3. And now queen d7. Perhaps not such an accurate move. Perhaps queen a5 or queen c7 were more accurate. And this is a way of playing castling short. What Magnus did with castling long is also possible. Okay. Queen d7 I don't like so much, because as we will see in the game, the possibility of a pin, and this pin being very, very annoying, is a real possibility, which we will see in the game, with knight d5 coming as well. And against queen d7, actually, Magnus had an interesting plan with knight h4, aiming to, as you can see from the arrows, to reroute this knight to h4, g2, e3, and d5. We can see this fully in action in this line. So castles, knight g2, and sorry, my bad, it's knight h4, a6, and now knight g2, knight e7, and now knight e3. And you have an excessively strong bind on this pawn. You might even play this later on, trade off these two pieces, and remain with this against this, or this against this, a knight against the bishop, which would be practically winning for white. So the Svechnikov, these kinds of Svechnikov structures are really instructive to teach you about good knight versus bad bishop. Okay, against knight h4 there is also the long castles line, which is met by knight g2. Again, going for this knight e3 idea, but since long castles happened and now d5 is much stronger, probably better is to just put the bishop here, the knight here, and now you're threatening bishop f5, picking up the queen. So black stops that, and now queen f3, adding further pressure to f5. And you can notice that this bishop is entombed, basically. So again, knight h4, there's h6, but here simply bishop b5, and again, this is why I didn't like queen d7 so much. A slight inaccuracy. Now Magnus commits another inaccuracy with queen e2, not another, but an inaccuracy perhaps with queen e2. I wouldn't label this as such a strong inaccuracy, of course, but it's maybe an inaccuracy because it does allow knight d4 at some point. Now, black castles, which is perhaps not as accurate. Okay, no, castles is fine, but after Magnus here castles, black goes for a kind of, I want to label maybe a simplistic maneuver that doesn't actually work tactically. So he develops with bishop h6 check. White wants to play king b1 anyway, and now he plays bishop g4. Okay, what was better was just to play king b8, and after these moves to go for this kind of setup, trying to push through f5. White is of course better here because again this bishop is entombed, but at least your bishop has greater scope now. There are possibilities of playing f4, e4, and bishop g7, so this isn't completely lost as of yet. Sorry, I went over this line a bit too quickly, but This is these are very normal moves. Okay, so bishop h6 check was played, king b1, and bishop g4. The problem with this line is that Magnus plays the best move, which is bishop b5. Again, I have knight d5, and when I come to f6, look at how many pieces I'm attacking. When I come to f6, I'm attacking the bishop on g4, the rook on g8, and the queen on d7. A master fork. Master fork. And not only that, but this pin is very strong and annoying, because I might have, after knight d5, maybe to play knight b4, adding more pressure on the pinned piece. f5 was tried. This is again an inaccuracy. Here white is much better, but black can try for a6. And after knight d5, sorry, a6 would show actually why this is bad. a6, knight d5, threatening a fork here. So black moves out of the fork, and now knight takes f6. And this is completely collapsing. Too many pieces. A fork is happening. But here perhaps king b8 would have held on better, because after h3 there's bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, and now we have an excessive clamp here. Knight d4 is not possible because of rook takes d4, and we would win the queen. So black would have to move the queen, and we would just move the rook back and be up a piece. But here queen e6 is possible, but against queen e6, look at this crazy move, queen d3. Queen d3, it's not a crazy move, of course, but the point is that I maintain excessive control over d5, and this bishop is forever entombed. As long as I can stop black from playing f5, I'm killing off this bishop forever. So what happens if after king b8, white plays knight d5, there's again queen e6, h3, bishop takes, bishop h5 would be met with g4, takes, and now after knight d4, look at this move. We sacrifice, yes, a clean sacrifice, nothing going on here. But the reason is that this bishop is dead, and our control over these two squares means a lot. So we come here, and now we will back this pawn by force, basically. Queen e5, I can just take on f6. And here, even queen takes h3. Now we fork these two minor pieces, these two major pieces. The check is not possible, of course, and the check on f1 is not possible. Because now if we win back the exchange, let's say, now we're left off with this kind of middle game, which is of course completely winning for white, because this bishop is just dead. This bishop is dead. As long as I'm controlling f5 and d5, I have an extremely superior position. And look at these pawns. They're so bad. They're so bad. All of these pawns are isolated. While look at white's structure. Black has four pawn islands, while these are pawn islands. This is a pawn island. 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 While white only has two. So an excellent position for white. Now, this said though, after king b8 and knight d5, this might be lost, but it offers more tenacious defense. After f5, it's very easy because we're picking up an exchange cleanly. So here f5, in this line at least we're the ones who are sacrificing the exchange, right? So maybe black has chances because he has an some extra material. But after bishop b5, f5, white plays h3. And as you can see, this is completely lost. Knight d4 never works because of bishop takes d7 check. Now here you take, and if bishop h5, you simply play g4, intending to me it takes with ba-boom, knight takes e5. The knight can't take because it's pinned, the pawn can't take because it's pinned, and I'm threatening to play h takes g4 and pick up this bishop. So if white does nothing, if black does nothing, okay, this isn't a nothing move. Let me find a better nothing move. Let's say king b8. I can take and take here. Of course, knight takes c6 might be even stronger, but I'm just showing you the tactical point. So bishop takes, queen takes, again knight d4 isn't possible. F takes, knight takes, and now black is losing something. White is attacking both d6 and f6 with a fork. One way to prevent that would be some queen e7, but here I just take off the knight and play knight f6. My idea is to play queen f5 check. My idea is to play queen takes c6. This is completely lost for black. So he tried queen c7, here, because now knight takes d6 check of course isn't possible, but Magnus plays correctly, knight f6, taking aim at this rook. And now what Magnus wants to do is to simply win something with the d5 bishop d3 tactic. So we'll see this. Rook g6, knight d5, gaining a tempo on the queen. The queen moves to d7, and now bishop d3, and this rook, if it has to move, will play queen h5, which is what happened in the game later on. Instead of bishop d3, there's maybe knight b4. This is also winning, but what Magnus played is fine. I can show you one sample line which goes into a completely winning endgame. So here note that we don't take here because that would be relieving the tension. We add more pressure or reroute our queen. It's not adding more pressure because the queen on f3 was already attacking c6. And here we can play this position and end up with an endgame, 3 pawns up, easily winning. Okay, this is one sample line. Of course, there are many deviations. I was just showing you one sample line to see how play could have continued. But bishop d3 of course is winning. It wins an exchange. Knight d4 and now queen h5. Knight d4 doesn't really bother us because at any point we can play c3, and this happened in the game later on c3. So knight d4, queen h5. Now if you move the rook anywhere, I simply take this bishop. So okay, my bad there. Queen h5, bishop g7, giving up the exchange. White takes it, and this is a clear win. Queen g4 offering to trade the queens. Note that if f5 blocking the trade, I can simply take a pawn. So knight e6 is played, the only way to prevent the queen trade, basically. Knight f5 is possible, I guess, but that runs into its own issues with these ideas and stuff like that. Okay, so knight e6 and now h4, or like against knight f5, white can also play h4 as happened in the game. So knight e6, h4, just trying to destroy the structure with h5. Very precise play by Magnus, of course. He's the friggin' world champion, for God's sake. So king b8, and now h5, destroying the structure. If g5 is played, this is absolute absolute annihilation. This bishop is completely dead then. So at least g takes f5, and now g takes h5, and now rook takes h5. Rook f8, trying to play f5, but even f5 is prevented thanks to this rook, so nothing doing there. c3, Magnus calmly prevents knight d4, queen f5, and rook h7 attacking this piece. If black does nothing, we of course win this piece. I mean, we're already up in exchange, so when we win 2 minor pieces, we're actually we transform our advantage to an entire piece up. So black moved out of the way, and now queen b4, trading pieces, because obviously when you're ahead in material you need to trade. Queen takes b4, knight takes b4, attacking d6, that is defended, knight check, king d7, and now a very precise move, adding more pressure to the h8 bishop. Bishop g7 defends the bishop thanks to this guy, but now f4, really breaking this position, aiming to go like this. f5 is played to stop this idea, and now rook h6, making use of this pin. I should show it like this. Can't friggin' draw arrows as usual. So rook f7 to break off the spin. Now the rook on h6 is hanging, so the rook is moved, and actually here black resigns, because let's imagine king c6. There's rook takes d5, and simply this, and now this bishop is lost, or the rook is lost. If instead of king c6 we play something like b5, simply g4. G4 would be one way to win, but knight e3 is more accurate. And now g4, and I take here, so if you take back, I take with check, and completely over, obviously. Now you should be careful here not to take, because that would be perhaps dangerous. Maybe even this is winning, but of course not needed. So after e2 you just retreat and win easily. Okay, and what instead of after rook g6, king e8 obviously loses an entire piece. So after b5 there's simply g4, no, knight e3. knight e3. There is also g4 if you want to really aggressively play here and win these minor pieces, but here it's 4 pawns against 3. It's obviously winning, but it requires technique. So the easiest here will be after b5 to just play knight e3 and go for this g4 f5 idea. So a very clean game by Carlsen, smooth game. I can show you in the graph here. I have another chapter just for the graph. If we look at Magnus's graph, look at it. Barely anything wrong. The computer here dips a bit after g3, but g3 is completely fine. And it dips here after queen e2, which is labeled as an inaccuracy, and I kind of tend to agree. But that's it. Magnus played a perfect game, understanding all the ins and outs of strategy. So we will take a further look at this in the other sections of this video. Take care. So as a summary for this video, preventing bishop g5 and Svechnikov structures when possible should be deeply considered with h6, as we saw in this game. h6 stops bishop g5, pinning the knight and causing a great deal of damage to black's structure. And stopping black's pawn breaks, f5 and d5, help white entomb black's dark squared bishop. So when we stop these pawn breaks, black's dark squared bishop is forever entombed by his own pawns. And putting pieces on the d5 square and the Svechnikov structures is very important. And a principle that maybe Magnus broke is playing queen e2, which is perhaps too passive. Perhaps. But of course, this is the very slight criticism, the only very slight criticism I have of this entire well-played masterpiece. So for the key concepts of this video, there are basically only two. The d5 square, you need to put pieces on it, of course not pawns, just put pieces, pile up the pressure on the backward d6 pawn. And the f5 square, you should stop black from playing f5, because that would activate potentially his dark squared bishop. So keep f5 under wraps. So let's take a look for the application novel settings part of this video. We'll take a look at a game played in the same line between two very strong players. So the same line, and here bishop d3 stopping f5, and now h5 is the move that's played in this game. If you remember, in the Magnus game, his opponent played rook g8. So h5, knight h4, putting a clamp on f5, d5 takes, knight takes, queen takes, and bishop f5. This is a line we saw earlier, so that's why I'm not going over it so much. And now rook d8. Okay, rook d8. White simply decides to keep the queens on the board, to trade off the queens, and go into this endgame. c3, stopping knight d4, knight b4, bishop b4 check, very good. And now bishop h6, maybe the only way he saw to develop the bishop. Bishop c5 would develop the bishop, but it's really not doing much there. So bishop e4, and now bishop e4, obviously wanting to make use of this knight, going to f5. But now black makes use of this bishop being here to play the rook here. So rook b2 simply defending, and now rerouting to further control f5 and d5. Castles, king d8, getting the king out of the center. Castling would maybe be too slow, so that's why black did this. But now he potentially drops a pawn. And white decides to go for this kind of endgame. So of course retreating is possible, but black didn't play this to retreat. And white here, of course, could have retreated himself, but he saw that this endgame wouldn't offer him much, so he enticed his opponent to go into this endgame with two minor pieces against the rook. But for his so the two minor pieces are facing off against the rook and the pawn, but this is an endgame, so the rook gains in strength, and white has a majority on this side. And these pawns really do stop off these four pawns. So let's see how white played this, because it's a very instructive endgame. Not going to delve into the ins and outs, just offer minor commentary. g3 of course stops knight f4, knight h4. f5 trying to get the pawns rolling. h4 putting a clamp on h5 pawn, stopping h4 by black, because Maybe white wants to avoid this kind of situation, which would completely tear apart his structure. So h4 was played. Now we don't mind this, because if at any point this happens, we really don't mind the structure. It's much better than having the broken structure there. Now b4, trying to push his majority. The rooks are traded, maybe not so wise by black, but okay, he did that. And now this rook is maneuvered to attack a7, forcing the king into a kind of passive position. And now c4, getting the pawns rolling. This pawn, this rook here, getting the rook activated. Bishop takes b4 is not possible because of this. So bishop e7, and now a4. Again, bishop b4 is not possible. Getting the pawns rolling. Here, note that bishop b4 would simply be met by rook takes a6. So a takes b5, rook takes b5, and now the pawns get rolling. The king is activated because you need to use your king in the endgame. And now after f4, black simply resigns, because after takes, what do we have? We have takes here, and takes is not possible because of check. So a very nice and well played game by white, very instructive. It shows the power of controlling these squares. So again, what was black's mistake? It's this entire line. Knight f6 is potentially a big inaccuracy. If you can't defend these positions, maybe you might have fun doing that, but just don't enter this. Play h6 here, and it should all be good. Since this is a video about our world champion, Magnus Carlsen, I thought I'd include a fun fact about Norway. The Kingdom of Norway was founded in 872 AD. Yep, quite a long while ago. So some questions we can maybe discuss in the comments. How far apart in terms of kilobytes of chess knowledge do you feel Magnus and the 2100 are? It must be quite a lot, but like by how much of a factor? Maybe 10 times, maybe 20 times, 5 times, 3 times, something like that. And this game, does it show that the other game we saw on the application novel settings, do these two games put the entire line with knight f6 for black in question? Or is there a way to salvage some sort of equality for black? Or should black just play h6 and be done with this line? With that, I shall end this video here, and hope to see you in another one. Take care, guys.